Unit number 9 will be a discussion of the types of egoism, psychological and ethical egoism, and we'll consider the importance of altruism. In this unit, we're going to be looking at the following points of interest. First, the definitions and distinctions between psychological and ethical egoism. And then we're going to look at the major arguments in support of those two theories. And then we're going to look at the concerns and questions about it and some of the arguments in support of altruism. In this regard, it's worthy to pause a moment and remind ourselves, for the first time, I think, that the academic study of ethics has three major areas: descriptive ethics, normative ethics, and meta-ethics. In this course, we're primarily looking at normative ethics, but you will notice that I've highlighted that there's a sense in which ethical egoism has a corresponding descriptive form, psychological egoism. And in a sense, it's not really an ethical theory at all. It's a description, which that is exactly what descriptive ethics is, a description of the way people behave. I put this slide in for you so that you get an overall picture of how these things fit together. I'm not giving you any of the details of meta-ethics because that's outside the realm of this particular course. But before we go on, let's quickly look at some definitions. I've really taken Liddell's definitions for the purposes of keeping the textbook and the lectures together, rather than giving you two definitions. Psychological egoism is the theory of all human actions that are aimed at avoiding some personal loss or gaining some personal benefit. This is an explanation of actions. It tells you why people act, and the psychology is they're doing it for a personal gain or avoiding a personal loss. Ethical egoism, on the other hand, is concerned about the morality of actions. An action's been taken, why? Now, is it moral? This is the ethical egoism. And their ethical egoism argues that an action is morally right if and only if it's based on promoting one's self-interest. I've certainly gone into my definition, not Liddell's. Actions are morally right just because they best promote one's self-interest. And actions are morally wrong just because they fail to promote one's self-interest. Now, it's going to be important to realise that in this definition of ethical egoism, we're hearing an echo of the same sort of issue that came up in consequentialism and utilitarian ethics, and that is that if one does not meet the standard for saying an action is morally justified, then it is morally wrong. This comes about because of the exclusiveness of the standard. Let's just remind ourselves that, again, we always start with the value theory in this course because it really drives the basis of ethical judgments being made and the theory that's developed around it. You'll notice that the right-hand column contains a personal and social aspect. If it's personal, it's got a little P in brackets. After it's social, it's got S in brackets. Epicurus, for example, was interested in a life without pain. That was the good life. That was his high value. Plato, on the other hand, was interested in harmony of the soul, the three parts of the soul living in harmony and being ruled by reason. Justice, on the other hand, was the harmony of the state in the same way as the soul finds harmony, that the state is ruled by reason, led by philosopher kings and queens, and those rules are enforced by the guardians and the people, the third level, the three parts of the soul reflected in society. Aristotle was interested in virtue, a happy, virtuous life, and the happy, virtuous life was one that you could see at the end of your life. look back and say, I've lived a good life, a virtuous life. And social ethics were built around facilitating that kind of personal happiness. So there was an interaction between personal and social. Jewish Christian, we saw redemption individually and redemption of the group, namely the church and community. Kant's rationalism, autonomy and reason were to drive every action. It was to be on the basis of autonomy and reason, and hence the categorical imperative. And society was to function around rational order. Now that brings us to the social contract, and here in this modern era, we move from social contract to consequentialism, psychological egoism. We've got two more to look at. Here, basically taking Locke's view, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property was the goal, the highest goal. That was the good life. Being free to live that life. Perhaps I should have written freedom equals life, liberty, being able to pursue these things. And the task of the society was to produce and to protect, I should say, those rights. Now, what's distinctive about consequentialism is we saw this emphasis on that an act is only morally right if it is only promoting one's personal well-being. Excuse me, I have a cold. And at a social level, an act is only moral if it only produces the well-being in the world, increases the well-being in the world. Increases well-being in the world. Psychological or ethical egoism, it's only what benefits us. That's the only good thing. That's the good life, having things benefit us. The motivation for our public is only our personal self-interest. There's no motivation, really, for acting in the community. These become exclusive standards. The word only is significant. Well, the history of egoism. Well, it's a relatively new ethical doctrine. Henry Sedgwick, an English scholar, in his book Methods of Ethics, is the first one to sort of introduce the topic, introduce the title, and distinguish it as a distinctive form of consequentialism that totally stands out from all the traditional forms of consequentialism, or the traditional forms of utilitarianism, in other words. And I've got the distinction marked for you at the bottom. Utilitarianism sought to maximize overall pleasure, whereas ethical egoism focused only on maximizing the individual's pleasure. The distinction between a broader category of pleasure, which can include the community, as well as society as a whole, whereas egoism focuses only on the individual's pleasure. This was refined and discussed more by James Rachel. He was dean in the University of Alabama, I think, for many years. He's a great Southern and distinguished American scholar. In his Elements of Moral Philosophy, you'll notice it's published in 2009, whereas he died in 2003. That's because his son republished and re-edited his works. What's important about Rachel's is he set out 3 reasons for the idea of ethical egoism. And you can see them set out in detail here. We know our own needs, we know our own desires, but the real crunch comes in the therefore at the bottom of this first point. Now I'm going to highlight it so that there's no question you can see it. There. It's reasonable to believe that if we set out to be our brother's keeper, we would often bungle the job and end up doing more mischief than good. It's an interesting view, really. Second reason. It's an interesting reason. It faces this question of altruism. Altruism, of course, is for no reason at all, doing good things to other people, without the hope of gaining any benefit whatsoever for yourself. Rochelle points out that egoism is of the view that altruism ultimately denies an individual's value and is therefore destructive of both society and the individual. Because altruism means you live your life sacrificially for others, which is devaluing your life, so it is argued. And the most perhaps interesting of all of the arguments, because you've already seen this third one before in relation to utilitarianism, all of our commonly accepted moral duties, from doing no harm to others, to speaking always the truth, to keeping promises, are rooted in one fundamental principle, the one fundamental principle, self-interest. And just to sort of give you another philosophical perspective, one you may not have heard of before, Ayn Rand, in her own lifetime, she was recognized as a philosopher, more known in the community as a writer, a playwright, a Russian immigrant who very strongly anti-communist. She advocated reason as the only way of acquiring knowledge. She rejected concepts of faith and religion. She really supported ethical egoism and absolutely rejected altruism. And in support of ethical egoism, I've given you two of her quotes here. If a man accepts the ethics of altruism, his first concern is not how to live his life, but how to sacrifice it. A theme you'll hear coming up with many egoists. The purpose of morality, she goes on to say, is to teach you not to suffer and die, but to enjoy life and enjoy yourself. Interesting perspective. Well, let's turn our attention to psychological egoism. And again, I'm going to reflect using Adele's definitions. He gives you it as the theory that all human actions are aimed at avoiding some personal loss or gaining some personal benefit. Now, just looking at that, you can see it's basically a description of how people behave. Hence, it's in that first column of descriptive ethics. It's fundamentally an argument from science. Let's just pause for a moment and reflect on this. If we go back for a moment to Sedgwick is writing at a time when science is becoming a profound influencer in all areas of life, in philosophy, in ethics, in religion, as well as in what you might call the other areas of the Academy's work, in biology and geology and astronomy. And the views of Darwin and various naturalists were growing, along with the growth and development of psychology as a science. And there was a desire, which was felt by people like Henry Sedgwick, who took it very seriously, of how psychology can address the issues of why people do things and what is morality. Does psychology tell us something about morality? And so it's in his era that there's a growing interest to try and explain psychologically moral behaviour. It becomes descriptive ethics. And to then postulate a form of ethics out of that, which would give you rules for living, give you normative ethics. And that's really the origin of egoism. And if we come back to this definition of psychological egoism, you can see that it is driven, I might say its background context is that science, particularly the science of psychology, has shown us that our only human motivation is self-interest. Now today, when you ask the question, is modern psychology coming to this conclusion that altruistic acts are impossible because we act totally out of self-interest. Now, regardless of what we might view as the modern science, let's stop and think. We're philosophers and ethicists here. Most of us would agree, firstly, that altruism is not a duty. In some circumstances, rescuing people and being a hero is required, for a fireman is expected to rescue you. It's his job. And there's a sense in which it's morally at least commendable, if not your duty, to render assistance to someone if you can, if they are in need. But what's important here is to say that psychological egoism is asserting that all altruism is just not possible. We have to do only out of self-interest. And what is more, it really questions the morality of things like the fire service. If we act only in self-interest, then we have to come up with a very interesting argument for why a fireman needed to be a fireman and why we should rescue someone from burning building. But it leaves the question, has modern science and psychology finally and conclusively concluded that we're only motivated by self-interest? It'll be obvious to you that I don't think it has. That poses a question about altruism. Are we justified in asserting that acts of bravery are altruistic? Now, I've just a little discussion with you here. The point is, we don't need to prove that all the acts of heroism we see, and each and every one of them, is purely and only motivated by altruistic motivations. In other words, I can have mixed moral motives. And that's not bad. Or put another way, we do not have to prove that an altruistic act was performed by self-interest alone, hence it's not altruistic. All we need to do is to show that there is some element of altruism in an act of bravery. Now, in this discussion, it's more than appropriate to distinguish from our discussion persons who are taking their own lives because that's in their interests. They want to avoid pain, they want to prevent their relatives going through the agony of caring for them, they want to prevent unnecessary expense and care for their wives and leave big enough estate that their wife can function for the rest of her life. These are clearly types of self-interest that someone takes their own life. We'd view it perhaps even as a heroic act. But given our instinct for self-preservation, we see it psychologically, we see it in reality, we see it in our individual lives. We are confronted with an issue that sends a question: is it reasonable to assert that a rational person would lay down their life for another person without having some very persuasive reason? And that very persuasive reason is going to have more character, width and depth of them simply their self-interest, excluding those heroic suicide situations. Heroic acts may be motivated by many factors. An overwhelming sense of duty, enjoying the crisis, enjoying the moment, love for friends. You may see a friend in trouble and want to help them because you just love them. And quite frankly, many acts of heroism are just interested in the well-being of other people. We don't like to see other people in trouble. We have a sense of that. And in that situation, we're willing to give up something of our own self-interest. I always think how interesting it is. We can be rushing to an appointment and suddenly there is a massive car accident in front of us. And we stop and we help as best we can, and we want to help, and we put aside things like, I've got to be in class to teach, and I'm going to face the dean and explain why I didn't turn up on time for my class. Well, we're willing to do that. And I imagine many of you have done something like that and realise that, yes, you might be fascinated by the circumstances, attracted to the drama. At the same time, all you want to do is help. Well, can we have arguments for supporting egoism? Well, first and foremost, I've given you Rochelle's and Rand's arguments. They're really classic arguments. Adele's given you some others. The argument from expected benefit, the appeal to guilty conscience, and expand the realm of self-interest. 3 arguments. He set them out in his textbook for you. I've just summarised them here. I want to point out that the appeal to a guilty conscience is in fact a very strong argument that Plato uses in the Republic. Plato comes to the conclusion that people are fundamentally good, that they have a free will. And as he understands human nature, he wants to say people are basically good, and they want to be good because it's good to be good. And he then talks about the importance of a free conscience, free from condemnation, the sense of guilt. Probably you know that one of the tactics police officers use or enforcement officers use when they're interrogating people in relation to a crime, there's a very famous argument. It goes like this: you'll feel a whole lot better when you make a confession and get it off your chest. And the irony is that many do. And they can't confess their crime quickly enough. It's an amazing reality in human experience. I'll leave you to look at those 3 arguments. I think Rachel and Rand's are the most important ones, frankly. Now we turn our attention to ethical egoism. Now remember, we've shifted. In psychological egoism, we're looking at a description of the act. The person's doing this motivated by self-interest. When it comes to ethical egoism, we're trying to work out when is an action morally right and when is it morally wrong. It's morally right when it's promoting your own self-interest. And it's morally wrong when you're not promoting it. And hence, if you're engaging in an act of altruism, you're doing something that's morally wrong. It's an astonishing argument. But this is clearly an ethical theory, because it gives a rational basis for defining which acts are morally right and which are morally wrong. So it's clearly a normative moral theory. All right, some of the problems here, even for ethical egoism. Well, there's a sense in which it's possible for core moral beliefs to be deemed to be immoral. Or put another way, what we would normally assert are clear moral wrongs being required duties. If I was teaching you face-to-face, I think I would be give you a number of examples of these possibilities, but I think it's sufficient. It's in your best interest to murder somebody, in your self-interest. Your father has made his will, and he's left all his $100 million of resources. There's a happy thought. And as soon as he dies, they're yours. Well, it's in your best interest to see your father dead and to want him dead. That's just one illustration. Particularly interesting because in the area of social ethics, it's problematic for ethical egoism to work. And one of its big problems is if self-interest is the only morally right thing, then I can't impose upon you or me the duty to respect somebody else's right, because it diminishes my ability to meet my own self-interest. So in a sense, it rules out the possibility of society obligating itself to me or to you and recognizing your rights, and that I have to recognize them as well. And frankly, it's arbitrary. It makes self-interest the all-important thing. And I think we just have a sense of how tortuous that is. Well, are there arguments in support? Well, again, Rochelle's and Rand are key. Liddell summarises 3 recent arguments. The first one, society is better off if everyone is actively caring for their own affairs. There's some attraction in that, by the way. And if you listen to many proponents of libertarianism, effectively that's their argument. The state needs to leave us alone so that we can pursue our best interests, because that's the best thing for everybody, including us. The libertarian argument is an interesting one. It presupposes that moral duties only have 2 sources: consent and reparation. Now, having stated that, one should go, but doesn't ethical egoism insist there's only one moral good, namely self-interest? Well, a duty, I consent to it, but I'd be consenting with my own self-interest. Or I'd be repaying somebody for something that was in my self-interest to repay them. If I've not consented to help someone, I owe them a duty of any kind. If I haven't consented to help somebody, then I'd have a duty. By the way, this is interesting, because if you know anything about the law concerning the Good Samaritan rescuer, in theory, a Good Samaritan is totally protected from being sued if he does something that hurts a person he's trying to rescue. Imagine the scene. You're a Good Samaritan, you've come to an accident, you have gone to help the person and you drag them out of the car. You do all you can to protect their neck. You know that neck injury is serious, but you don't have a neck brace. But you fear the car is going to burst into flames. You drag them out of the car, and by dragging them out of the car, you actually break the neck and they become a quadriplegic. So the neck was not broken in the accident, it was broken by you when you rescued them. Well, you've taken on an obligation, and that obligation is to reasonably care for somebody. It doesn't protect you absolutely. The law does not protect the Good Samaritan absolutely, but the Good Samaritan acted in good faith. Now, in that particular instance, you could probably argue the Good Samaritan did the best he could. He took the risk of causing neck injury because he was concerned to get the person away from the burning car. But if the car wasn't burning and you did that same act, it would be reasonable for you to drag a person out of the car knowing you might injure their neck. The answer might be no, and you might be liable for that action because you breached a duty of care that you had voluntarily taken on. So this libertarian argument's an interesting one, and there's some strength to it. And this is the third. If you have a good reason for doing something, then you're better off doing it. Well, I agree with that. But it doesn't necessarily support ethical egoism. It's just simply that it explains an aspect of self-interest. Well, that brings us to this question. What do you need to be able to do following this course? And it means get ready for a test. Well, you explain the definitions, set out the majority arguments both ways, outline the major questions and concerns about ethical egoism, and explain some of the arguments in favour and support. Thank you for watching the video.